Hello everyone. This presentation is a part of the YRJ Winter Research Program 2025. My name is Adrika Hazra and I worked under the mentorship of Sanaul Haq. Today I will be presenting my research titled Investigating the Cashless Economy of Bangladesh
A
from a
cashless
Global
economy
Perspective,
refers to an
where
economic
I
system where
quantitatively
financial
compare
transactions are
Bangladesh with
conducted
Sweden
digitally
and
rather than
China.
using physical cash. With advancements in technology, digital payments have become increasingly important for efficiency, transparency, and financial inclusion. Countries around the world are transitioning at a different speeds, making this an important area of study. Bangladesh presents a unique case. The country has seen rapid growth in mobile financial services such as bKash and Nogod, supported by government led digitalization initiatives. However, challenges such as limited literacy, infrastructure gaps, and trust issues still restrict the full adoption of a cashless economy. Sweden and China were selected for comparison because they represent two of the most advanced cashless economies globally. Sweden has almost eliminated cash usage, while China has experienced explosive growth in digital payments through platforms like Alipay and WeChat Pay. Comparing Bangladesh with these countries highlights critical differences in policy, technology. The primary objectives of the research were to compare the level of cashless adoption between Bangladesh, Sweden, and China, to identify key economic and technological differences, and to evaluate Bangladesh's current position within the global cashless economy. This study follows a quantitative research design. Secondary data was collected from reliable sources such as central banks, global financial databases, and international reports. Key indicators such as digital transaction volume, internet penetration, and mobile payments usage were analyzed and compared across the three countries. The findings show that Sweden has the highest level of digital payment adoption supported by their strong infrastructure and public trust. China demonstrates rapid growth driven by technology and private sector innovation. Bangladesh shows promising growth but adoption remains uneven due to structural and socio-economic barriers. The comparison suggests that Bangladesh can learn valuable lessons from Sweden's regulatory framework and China's technological innovation. Strengthening digital infrastructure, improving cybersecurity, and increasing financial literacy are crucial steps for accelerating Bangladesh's transition towards a cashless economy. In conclusion, Bangladesh has strong potential to develop a cashless economy, but sustained policy support and technological investments are required. A structured and inclusive
Video games are often seen as just entertainment, right? But what if the types of games adolescents play actually shape how they think and solve problems? This is where this research comes in handy, where we explore the relationship between video game genre preferences and problem solving approaches among adolescents in Bangladesh. This study was conducted as a part of the YRJ Research Winter Research Program 2025 under the mentorship of Sanal Haq Bhaya and MD Azmain Yakin Shrizan Bhaya. I'm Fahim, working paired with Afique Sobhan and Jarif Sameen, and today in this presentation, we'll walk you through our methodology, findings, and key insights. So let's get started. First of all, we can see in recent years, gaming has emerged as one of the primary leisure activities among adolescents, largely due to increased smartphone access and affordable internet, making gaming a near universal experience for young people. That's what expected, right? Beyond entertainment, modern video games place significant cognitive demands on players. Many genres require strategic decision making, effective resource management, and adaptive thinking, and continuous learning through feedback, trial, and error. Despite this, public discourse and academic research have largely emphasized the negative consequences of gaming, such as addiction, exposure to violent content, and internet gaming disorder, often overlooking a more balanced perspective. Thus, as a result, potential positive relationship, particularly those related to problem solving skills and cognitive flexibility, remain relatively understudied. Furthermore, much of the existing research is based on weird populations, meaning Western, educated and industrialized, rich and democratic societies. This creates a contextual gap as adolescents in countries like Bangladesh grow up with level cultural, educational, and social dynamics that may influence how gaming affects cognition.
Thank you so much, Fahim, and I'll take it from here. So, what's up, everyone? My name is Afique Sobhan, and I'll continue the presentation from here on. So, after the introductory part, we can start with research gap and purpose. So, the primary research gap that we identified is that in terms of gaming cognition research, there just wasn't enough research done in non-weird populations, which is not Western educated or industrialized, rich or democratic populations such as Bangladesh, and specifically Bangladeshi adolescents, which is the population we targeted. And another gap is that it remains unclear how preferences for distinct game genres might correlate with varying problem-solving styles, even though there have been past research papers on how problem-solving style correlates with specific game genres. The the research papers only focused on specific genres such as only action video games or only simulation games. But this paper ties together many genres together to find the overall cumulative correlation that underlies everything. And as the purpose of this study, we have decided to take three factors as a measure of problem solving approach, which is problem solving confidence, approach avoidance style, and personal control. Now, to define our research question, it is as written here: how does preference for different video game genres correlate with problem solving approach among Bangladeshi adolescents? And our independent variable was preferred video game genre, and the dependent variable was from the problem solving inventory, which is separated into three factors as mentioned above. Now, in terms of our methodology, we used a cross-sectional quantitative survey because it was efficient and easy to use for our design, and it was sufficient for our research. And the data collection was obviously done through Google Forms within December and January, and the sample size was 75 participants, which admittedly makes our research on the lower power side. And we sampled using convenience and snowball sampling, and participants were recruited via social media because a lot of social media users also play games, and that was the aim of our research. So in terms of for what was actually in our survey, there was primarily two sections. First is the genre engagement scale, where we gauged which genres the participants mainly engaged in gaming with, and we identified 6 primary genres, which is FPS, RPG, puzzle, sandbox or open world, simulation, and MOBA games. Now that was to categorize participants into groups as to which primary one genre they prefer to play. And then we assess their problem solving approach to real life scenarios using the problem solving inventory, which included several Likert scale questions, like on a scale of 1 to 6, how much would you agree that you like solving problems type questions for problem solving confidence, approach avoidance style, and personal control. Personal control is basically how much personal control one has over their emotions when solving problems. Now, in terms of our data that we got from our survey, this is this is just the descriptive analysis part that lists means and comparisons. So as we can see here, there isn't really too much of a difference between any of the charts, between any of the specific genres. Only the slight variances that we can expect is due to chance, but we can know how statistically significant these differences are in the later part. An important thing to note is that when we selected the responses where the participants gamed for more than 3 hours a week, the results were slightly different than when they did not. So this can lead us to assume that gaming engagement, like how much one games, is also a factor in how the relationship between genre preference and problem solving approach arises. So as the descriptive findings showed, there were no statistically significant difference, so the null hypothesis cannot be rejected, which is that there is no significant difference between problem solving styles and video game genre preference. And in terms of inferential findings, where we did the one factor one way ANOVA tests on all groups across all three factors, and again there were no statistically significant differences, as the probability is above 0.05, the critical value for all of the findings 0.43, 0.31 and 0.80. Now how will we interpret these values? Now, although we see slight variability, since we have not found out any statistically significant difference, we cannot say there is a correlation between video game genre preference and problem solving approach. But this may not be because there is no correlation, but more that this study was specifically underpowered to find such correlation, because we found one outlier when a one-way ANOVA test was performed on problem-solving confidence with gaming hours greater than 3. It revealed a large effect, eta squared 0.29, although it was insignificant because probability is slightly greater than 0.05. This reveals that, provided with sufficiently powered studies, it may be that there could be correlations between video game genre preference and problem solving styles. So to conclude, we found that there are preliminary evidence for nuanced genre cognition relationships, but future research needs to be done from here so that these relationships can be further clarified. First of all, with larger and more diverse samples, so that the research has sufficient enough power to establish if the correlation exists or not, and multi-method assessments like qualitative methods, as this survey only used a quantitative method. And finally, longitudinal designs which provide temporal data so that we can identify causal relationships. A big thing to note is that the entire research that we did was just to find correlations and not causal relationships. So further longitudinal studies can help us to find causal relationships if such exist. And that's the end of our research paper, and while we did not find any significant correlation, I believe that future research attempts could clarify that further. Thank you, everyone.
Hello everyone, I'm Arya Karim, and today I'm going to be presenting my research on the topic, the impact of green spaces on heat stress experienced in urban Dhaka. Before we start, this research was conducted under the YRJ Winter Research Program 2025, and I would like to acknowledge and thank our mentor Sanal Haq for his support. To commence with, we have the table of contents, which includes the topics that are to be discussed later on, starting with abstract, research question introduction, literature review findings, methodology, data analysis, limitations, and conclusions. Rapid urbanization and climate change have intensified heat stress in Dhaka, one of the world's most densely populated cities. Increasing built up areas and declining vegetation have made urban heat a major public health concern. While green spaces are known to provide cooling, few studies examine their effect on residents' perceived heat stress. This study used a survey of 50 participants to compare perceived heat stress between frequent and infrequent green space users. Results show that greater exposure to green spaces is linked to lower heat stress, highlighting their value as a human-centered climate adaptation strategy. Then we have our research question, which states, does frequent access to urban green spaces significantly lower perceived heat stress among residents in Dhaka compared to those with infrequent access? Dhaka, Bangladesh's capital, is a rapidly growing megacity of over 20 million people. Rapid urbanization and loss of vegetation have intensified urban heat island effects, with daytime and nighttime temperatures often higher than surrounding areas. Summer heat combined with high humidity increases heat stress, affecting productivity, outdoor activity, and vulnerable populations such as elderly, children, and outdoor workers. Urban green spaces, parks, trees, and water bodies can reduce temperatures through shading and evapotranspiration. While many studies measure cooling effects physically, fewer examine residents' perceived heat stress. This study investigates whether access to and frequent use of green spaces is associated with lower perceived heat stress in Dhaka, providing a human-centered view of urban climate adaptation. Moving on, we have our literature review findings, which are as follows. Urban areas experience higher heat stress due to dense construction, impervious surfaces, and reduced vegetation cover. Urban heat stress has become a critical environmental and public health issue in rapidly urbanizing cities worldwide. A large body of research focuses on the urban heat island effect, which explains why urban areas experience higher temperatures than surrounding rural areas. Secondly, residents of densely populated tropical megacities face heightened vulnerability to heat stress. Heat stress has been shown to negatively affect human health and daily functioning. Prolonged exposure to high temperatures is associated with dehydration, fatigue, reduced productivity, and increased risk of heat-related illnesses. In tropical cities, high humidity further worsens thermal discomfort by reducing the body's ability to cool through evaporation. Furthermore, vegetation has been scientifically proven to reduce heat stress. A substantial portion of existing literature examines the role of urban green spaces in mitigating urban heat. Vegetation cools the environment through shading and evapotranspiration, which lowers surface and near-surface air temperatures. Numerous studies using satellite imagery and field measurements report significantly lower land surface temperatures in parks, tree-covered areas, and vegetated corridors. Moreover, visual exposure to greenery contributes to heat stress relief. Emerging studies on perceived thermal comfort indicate that individuals often feel cooler and more comfortable in green environments even when objective temperature differences are relatively small. Visual exposure to greenery combined with shade and improved airflow have been shown to reduce perceived heat stress and psychological strain. Then we're going to be discussing the methodology used. A cross-sectional quantity survey-based research design was opted for this study. This design was chosen due to its efficiency, ability to collect immediate data, and suitability for comparing pre-categorized groups. This study uses data representing 50 residents of urban Dhaka aged 15 years and above. Participants were divided into two groups: frequent green space users, 3 or more visits per week; infrequent or non-users, less than 1 visit per week/no visits. A structured questionnaire was designed to measure green space usage and perceived heat stress. To examine differences in perceived heat stress between frequent and infrequent green users of green spaces, descriptive and comparative statistical analysis were conducted on a dataset of 50 respondents. Perceived heat stress was measured using a composite Likert scale score ranging from 1 very low heat stress to 5 very high heat stress. The results are shown below in Table 1. Frequent greenspace users reported a mean heat stress score of 2.6 with a standard deviation of 0.7, indicating generally low to moderate perceived heat stress with relatively limited variation among respondents. In contrast, infrequent or non-users reported a substantially higher mean score of 3.8 with a standard deviation of 0.6, suggesting consistently higher levels of discomfort. To visually represent these findings, the figure 1 presents a bar chart comparing mean perceived heat stress scores between frequent and infrequent green space users, clearly illustrating the magnitude of difference between the two groups. Further delve into the statistics, the percentage-based findings shown in Table 2 below illustrate the contrast between frequent green space users and infrequent/non-users. Approximately 68% of frequent green space users reported low heat stress levels, scores of 1 to 6, and 26% reported medium heat stress levels, scores of 3, whereas only 22% of infrequent users fell within this range. Conversely, nearly 61% of infrequent or non-users reported high heat stress levels, scores of 4 to 6, compared to just 14% among frequent users. These differences highlight the practical significance of green space exposure beyond average scores alone. Figures 2 and 3 here represent the prior data. Figure 2 presents a pie chart showing the percentage distribution of respondents across low, moderate, and high heat stress categories for infrequent/non-users, while Figure 3 presents a pie chart showing the percentage distribution of respondents across low, moderate, and high heat stress categories for frequent green space users. However, this study has several methodological limitations that should be considered when interpreting the findings. The cross-sectional design captures perceptions at a single point in time, which limits the ability to establish causal relationships between green space use and perceived heat stress. As a result, the observed associations cannot confirm whether green space exposure directly reduces heat stress or whether individuals who experience less heat stress are more likely to visit green spaces. Secondly, the study relies on self-reported data, which may be affected by recall bias and subjective interpretation, particularly for perceived heat stress and frequency of green space visits. Furthermore, for this study, the environmental factors such as actual ambient temperature, humidity, time of day, and seasonal variation were not directly measured or controlled. These unmeasured variables may have influenced respondents' perceptions of heat stress independently of green space exposure. And finally, to conclude, this study shows that urban green spaces play an important role in reducing perceived heat stress among residents of Dhaka by highlighting human-centered benefits beyond objective temperature measures. The findings reveal substantial differences between frequent and infrequent green space users, with lower thermal discomfort, greater outdoor tolerance, and improved well-being among those with regular access, suggesting that even limited green space exposure can meaningfully enhance thermal comfort in a densely populated megacity. From a policy perspective, the results support preserving and expanding equitable access to urban greenery as a cost-effective climate adaptation strategy. And at last, my presentation ends here. Thank you for your time and patience.
Hello everyone. I hope you're doing well. Today I am going to do a presentation on a research that I've recently done. And to give you a rough title, it is actually a study on the role of environmental awareness and some statistics of school student carpooling in Dhaka North City Corporation. My name is Basil Alam. I am a 11th grader at IHSP, and I am part of the YRJ Winter Research Program session of 2025. My mentors are Mr. Sanal Haq and Mr. Azma Insrison, and I'm very excited to share this presentation. So let's start off with the background and the problem. Essentially, carpooling is a behavioral low-cost solution. In Dhaka, we'll see lots of rapid urbanization and motorization, which has given rise to insane traffic jam and a very heavy traffic congestion. Research shows, and which I've cited in my paper, research shows that almost millions of working hours are lost daily due to cars being stuck in traffic. Moreover, high reliance on single occupancy vehicles, especially private cars or office workers who travel in private cars, their reliance on these vehicles have given rise to lots of CO2 emissions. which is obviously bad for the ecological condition of Dhaka. So, amongst high cost infrastructural solutions such as building bridges and stuff, carpooling is also a low cost solution which depends on psychology of the commuters. Therefore, this study is addressing a large research gap that is present in Dhaka's communities, and it aims to test its feasibility in subtowns. So, the primary research question that I have wanted to study is the influence of environmental awareness on the willingness to carpool among high school and university students in Dhaka North. And the secondary question, which I hope to identify, is the primary perceived barrier that moderates relationships and analyzes its effect on the willingness of carpooling. Essentially, I wanted to analyze the effects of perceived barriers such as safety, um, gender, familial constraints. I wanted to test all of these on the willingness to carpool. So, again, like I've said these before, the main objectives was to analyze the relationship between awareness and willingness, identify key perceived barriers to carpooling, and compare the attitude and structural influences. So let's go on to the research methodology. Essentially, the way I tackled this was by creating a cross-sectional analytical survey in Google Forms at the advice of my mentor. Essentially, I made this Google form and I posted it on many different platforms, many academic platforms such as the YRJ journal itself in the Discord group, and some other several English medium and Bangla medium school student servers. Moreover, I utilized my own Facebook and Instagram page to get some outreach within high school students. And I also used different coaching centers as a place to market my survey so that it gets a higher outreach. And after a month of collecting responses and dishing out my link, we collected 177 responses. Afterwards, I collected all of the results in a CSV file from my Google Sheets and I analyzed the results using Jamovi software. We ran mainly three tests. Um, well, actually, two tests. We ran a correlation matrix and I also ran a linear regression test, along with calculating the means and standard deviations, which I will show you later on. And afterwards, I evaluated my results and started writing up my paper, and came to my conclusion of my own, which I will also discuss later on in this video. So the key variables I studied were number one, environmental awareness. The three variables you see on the screen were all computed variables. In my Google form, I made a 6 item scale using a Likert base scale with a scale of 1 to 6. So I intentionally added an even number so that participants would not decide on a middle value, which would have affected the results. A 6 item scale, so 6 different questions based on environment, which was used to calculate their awareness, and then 3 item scale for the willingness to carpool, and a 5 item liquor based scale for perceived barriers. So there were 5 questions. Here there are four, but you'll see another one later on. And my controls were commute distance, which was given on a range, and primary travel mode, which, for example, could be private car, school transport, Uber, or just walking, etc. So here are the descriptive results. The mean for the environmental awareness was about 4.3, um, which demonstrates a high willingness to sorry my which demonstrates a high um, value of protecting the environment. On the other hand, the other two values showed a lower mean. Willingness to carpool was around 3.79 to 3.8, which means that not many people, almost less than 4 out of 6 people, were willing to carpool. And the perceived barriers was 3.38. In this case, a high value of perceived barriers meant that more people were not willing to carpool. So a value of 3.38 meant that there were some perceived barriers, and this value was higher than I expected it to be. So the key takeaway was that there was high awareness, but only moderate willingness. Here are the statistical findings from my regression model. So in our correlation results, we had used we had compared the correlation between the three computed variables, which is awareness to willingness and then barriers to willingness. So the awareness to willingness showed a strong correlation, which with about 0.42 R value and a p-value less than 0.001. This shows that this was unlikely to happen without chance, and that there was a strong relation between this. Um, the results also show that environmental awareness and perceived barriers were both strong predictors, and they explained about one-third of the variation in willingness. Um, and in our regression model, we had got an achieved value of 0.335, and this shows that, like I said, awareness and barriers are strong predictors. However, in our research, commute distance and travel mode were not very significant. So if we were to interpret this, we could say that there was a strong psychological and social factor that played a big role when it came to the travel travel characteristics of the students. Moving on. Let's talk about the results. So, like I said, although it plays a role, awareness alone is not enough for peers to completely adopt carpooling, since the perceived barriers play a very big role. Trust, safety, and feasibility mattered more than what I initially thought it would be. And moreover, gender played a very clear role in influencing carpooling, as the value of male students' willingness to carpool was almost 5 out of 10 students. However, for female, it was 3 out of 10. And there was psychological factors outweighing distance or travel mode. Like I said, people who traveled a longer distance were more willing to not carpool. They were willing to travel by themselves. However, people living within close proximity of their school, within 1 to 3 kilometers of their school, and people who were walking or cycling, they were willing to carpool more. Um, and another discussion was that schools can play a very important role, because we saw that most of the entries were from IHSB and Scholastica. So uh, most of the students were willing to carpool within their own sector. So I will come to this again later. Let's first talk about the limitations of our research. While we did establish variables associations, the feasibility of these cannot be established properly because of the cross-sectional analytical survey. Like I said, we did use some simple questions, 6 item, 3 and 5 item questions. However, since this is more of a casual approach and does not give the a very hard and fast evidence of the data. Moreover, since this is a topic based on environment and environmental awareness, there will always be a social norm. So many peers may have given inflated responses or overly positive responses, which is contrary to what they actually do, especially in the environmental awareness section. So this masks actual data and the travel patterns of students, which um, lowers the reliance and reliability of the data. So, in conclusion, the findings indicate that environmental awareness is positively associated with willingness to engage in shared commuting, which complemented my initial hypothesis of a positive correlation. However, perceived ease of carpooling emerged as the strongest predictor, highlighting the importance of practical and structural factors in influencing willingness. So, in short, if we were to introduce carpooling into Bangladesh, especially within high school peers, we need to run longer observational surveys and perhaps conduct interviews over a longer period of time, and to also have some more programs to raise awareness about carpooling. And once this is done, so that we can build the trust between students, I believe that this would be a very feasible outcome for students, and this would reduce many hours wasted in traffic. That's all from our side. Thank you. Thank you to YRJ, and thank you to my mentors for this wonderful program. I hope to further enhance my research in the future. Thank you.
Hello everyone, I'll be presenting our study on the high temperature resilience of lithium-ion battery chemistries with a comparative focus on NMC and LFP batteries. This work examines how battery chemistry and cooling architecture influence thermal runaway behavior and safety under extreme urban operating conditions. I'll begin by briefly outlining the background and motivation for the study, followed by the problem statement and our research objective. I'll then discuss the literature gap, methodology, comparative analysis between NMC and LFP, cooling architecture performance, urban safety implications, key findings, and concluding recommendations. Electric vehicle adoption is accelerating globally, and lithium-ion batteries are the core energy storage technology enabling this transition. Although battery failure events are statistically rare, when they do occur, they are often high impact, involving thermal runaway, fire propagation, and hazardous gas release. As electric vehicles are increasingly deployed in dense urban environments, battery safety must be evaluated not just at the vehicle level, but also from a public safety and infrastructure perspective, particularly under elevated thermal stress. Most electric vehicle batteries are validated under standardized lab conditions, typically around 25 degrees Celsius. However, real-world urban environments frequently exceed 45 degrees Celsius due to urban heat island effects. This elevated thermal baseline significantly reduces the effective safety margin of lithium-ion batteries, especially during high-load scenarios such as fast charging or sustained discharge. For high-energy chemistries, this compression of thermal margin can push systems closer to critical failure thresholds. The objective of this research is to evaluate how battery chemistry and cooling architecture influence thermal runaway risk under extreme urban temperatures. The central research question we address is, how do NMC and LFP lithium-ion batteries differ in thermal runaway severity and safety performance under high ambient urban conditions, and which cooling strategies are effective in mitigating this risk? Existing literature has extensively studied lithium-ion battery failure mechanisms, particularly at the single cell level. However, most prior studies focus on mild ambient conditions and do not account for extreme urban thermal environments. There is limited integrated research evaluating hybrid cooling architectures alongside chemistry-specific safety behavior. This gap limits informed decision-making for battery selection, thermal management design, and urban infrastructure safety planning.
To address this gap, we conducted a Prisma-based systematic review of recent experimental studies published between 2024 and 2025. Only IEC 62660 to 662 compliant abuse testing data on large format lithium-ion cells were included. All data were normalized to 100% state of charge and a standardized heating rate of 4 degrees Celsius per minute to ensure comparability across studies. Using this dataset, we evaluated 4 thermal management strategies: air cooling, liquid cooling, phase change material cooling, and a hybrid thermoelectric PCM architecture. Before moving into the quantitative results, it's important to briefly frame what we are actually comparing. NMC and LFP batteries are often discussed as interchangeable lithium-ion technologies, but at a fundamental level, they represent 2 different design philosophies. NMC prioritizes high energy density and performance, while LFP prioritizes structural stability and thermal robustness. The next slides examine how these design choices translate into very different safety behaviors under extreme thermal stress. This slide presents a direct comparison of thermal runway behavior under identical abuse conditions. For nickel-rich NMC cells, thermal runway occurs at a peak temperature of approximately 708 degrees Celsius. This extreme thermal intensity is driven by oxygen release from the cathode, which sustains combustion and significantly amplifies fire severity. In contrast, LFP cells reach thermal runway at approximately 420 degrees Celsius. Their failure mechanism is predominantly venting dominated rather than combustion driven, resulting in lower flame intensity and reduced propagation risk. Overall, NMC exhibits roughly 68% higher thermal intensity compared to LFP, indicating a fundamentally narrower safety envelope. This slide compares the transient thermal response of lithium-ion cells under sustained load for different cooling architectures. Air cooling relies on low convective heat transfer and shows rapid temperature escalation under high ambient conditions. Liquid cooling improves initial heat removal but remains constrained by coolant inlet temperature and long-term heat accumulation. Phase change material systems absorb heat through latent energy storage, delaying temperature rise but eventually saturating. In contrast, hybrid thermoelectric PCM cooling combines active heat pumping with latent heat buffering, enabling near isothermal behavior and effectively suppressing temperature gradients and thermal propagation. To translate thermal performance into practical design guidance, this slide presents a comparative decision matrix for battery cooling strategies. Passive and intercell liquid cooling systems offer lower complexity but limited safety margins, making them suitable for small packs or standard operating environments. Porous PCM systems provide improved thermal buffering and are better suited for hot or tropical climates. However, for high-performance NMC systems operating in extreme urban environments, hybrid thermoelectric PCM architectures provide the highest safety margin by actively controlling temperature rise despite increased system complexity. These thermal differences translate directly into urban safety outcomes. NMC battery failure events require pedestrian exclusion distances of approximately 5.2 meters to avoid injury from thermal radiation. In contrast, LFP systems require an exclusion radius of approximately 2.8 meters. Given that typical urban sidewalk widths range from 2 to 3.5 meters, NMC failure scenarios exceed practical public safety margins, particularly in confined environments such as parking structures and roadside charging hubs. 4 key findings emerge from this study. First, battery safety under extreme thermal stress is primarily chemistry driven rather than cooling limited. Second, nickel-rich NMC systems trade energy density for disproportionately higher thermal and gas hazards. Third, LFP chemistry maintains a significantly wider safety envelope under elevated ambient temperatures. Finally, conventionally cooling approaches are insufficient under heat island conditions, while hybrid thermoelectric PCM systems uniquely suppress thermal non-uniformity and propagation risk. In conclusion, this study demonstrates that under extreme climate urban operating conditions, battery chemistry is the dominant determinant of electric vehicle safety. Lithium iron phosphate batteries exhibit substantially lower thermal runaway intensity and wider safety margins compared to nickel-rich NMC chemistries,
making them inherently more suitable for dense, heat stressed urban deployments. Where high energy NMC systems remain necessary, conventional cooling methods are inadequate, and hybrid thermoelectric PCM architectures are required to maintain thermal stability and prevent propagation. These findings highlight the need for chemistry aware thermal management strategies and updated urban infrastructure and safety standards. Thank you for your time and attention.
Hello, my name is DURBAR, and I have written a research paper on the impact of limited play spaces on teenagers in urban areas, a study of Dhaka city. So this basically is like there in Dhaka city, we have a very few play spaces. So what is the effect on teenagers for this? So we're going to study Dhaka city and say about this. uh, Introduction, the urban crisis, and the what challenge we face. So Dhaka, as we know, is one of the biggest cities in the world, and it's also, I think, one of the most unplanned cities in the world. It's very densely populated, and there is very less trees. Our research goal is to investigate how spatial limitations affect the anxious generation and their mental well-being. So this mainly talks about that in Dhaka city we have very less space. So how does this affect uh, our generation, the generation Z and their mental well-being? So the thesis here is the recreational infrastructure is not a luxury; it is a biological necessity for teenagers. Uh, so so this mainly tells that like the recreational infrastructure, like the fun things and the fun spaces, they are actually not luxury, but what every teenager should have. Historical concept. So Dhaka was a city captured by canals, ponds, and open fields. Then modern Dhaka is like less than 5% open space remains, and profit in real estate have contributed to that. Literature review why we need space, neuroscience perspective, physical activities serve as a spark that helps adolescents brain focus, learn, and develop cognitive abilities. So, from the neuroscience perspective, we do need spaces because if we play, our brain functions better, and like we can like focus and learn better and also perform. So, hence perform good in like academic activities. Sociological perspective is that public space not just like great good places, like we can build community and friendships. And without a like a public space like this, what happens is that we are not meeting with people, and so there's like a decline of community. The psychology of boredom. So as you can see, this person cannot go out. Like if even he so it's like hang out on the streets with his friends, but now that is also a problem. How can he get those friends if there is not like a third, like if there's not like a place where like all children comes and they play with each other. The psychology of boredom. Boring environments create a dangerous cycle. They lead to diminished attention, reduced focus, and chronic dissatisfaction among teenagers. Teenagers in Dhaka suffer from persistent dissatisfaction because they are physically stuck in confined spaces without unprecedented curiosity. So this just mainly tells that like due to the boredom, like due to no space available, they are just stuck in their like homes and they're getting very bored. And because of that, this can lead to obesity and like decline in their mental well-being. Methodology. So how did we do this research? So we actually got 100 teenagers and we did a survey where we gathered information from 100 teenagers and uh, we actually collected this through Reddit. We posted it on Reddit and we got it from there. The research method, quantitative survey design following from research protocols to ensure verification. This is the research method. Frequency of playground usage, self-reported boredom levels, age of screen time versus substitute for physical play. Findings, what we actually found, regular access was quite less, occasional access, and rare or no access. Yeah. Why? Like, what are the critical barriers to afford that? If you're seeing unsafe environments, like safety concerns and then like infrastructure failures, like they're playing on somewhere like where there's a lot of traffic congestions. Now the digital shift, as you can see, this person is like, is on social media for a lot of time. Why? Because there's there no spaces they have to do something. Like they cannot feel bored, and a lot of turn to physical game online. Sorry, online gaming. Uh, Questioning cycle. Our research uncovered alarming conditions limited to academic performance, so like 55% decline. Focus difficulty was like 48% actually reported that they had difficulty in focusing and like they had a lot of brain fog. So the conclusion we have here is that absence of play space is a fundamental driver of the boredom and mental health as affecting Dhaka's teenager, and immediate action is required, such as like play space, like we need to have more space to play, we need to have like shared PS program, and we don't have, and like if we don't have any spaces for field spaces, we actually have to innovate our rooftops to make it like better for playing. So this was a research, and I hope that you like it. Thank you.
If you picked up your phone this morning, could you say with a 100% certainty that every single image or article you had seen online was made by a real human being? As AI gets smarter, our eyes keep being put to the test every single day. This challenge led us to our research topic, can we tell AI from reality? We wanted to find out, does being online more often actually make us better at spotting a fake, or does it just make us more overconfident? This is a study of detection accuracy and influencing factors among students and adults in Dhaka. We would like to start by sincerely thanking our research mentors for their unwavering support and guidance. This research was conducted solely under the YRJ. My name is Rubama Raihan, and it is a pleasure to be here with my co-researcher, Sharika Alam, both of whom are a part of the 2025 Winter Research Program of Youth Research Journal. We're going to navigate through the study's background, research questions, literature review, methodology, data analysis, and the conclusion we came up with. To understand why detecting AI-generated media has become such a challenge today, it is useful to look briefly at how media manipulation has evolved over time. In the early 2010s, manipulations were mostly manual, filters or basic edits that were visible and required human skill, so deception remained limited. By the mid to late 2010s, AI-assisted tools began improving realism, marking a transition toward automation, though detection was still largely human-reliant. The early 2020s introduced deepfakes, where fast, cheap, and realistic face and voice generation began to outpace human perception, making evaluative competence essential rather than optional. Today, with widespread AI-generated text, images, audio, and video, media saturation has created a literacy gap. Digital fluency no longer guarantees the ability to judge authenticity. This shift highlights an urgent need for research focused on how different age groups, particularly teenagers in underrepresented contexts like Bangladesh, navigate and evaluate AI-generated media. So, we asked,
How accurately can students and adults identify AI generated media? And do confidence, social media use, and exposure to different AI content influence susceptibility to misinformation? Based on existing literature, we formed 4 key predictions. First, we hypothesized that adults would perform better than students due to life experience. Second, we expected the Dunning-Kruger effect, where high confidence actually leads to more errors. Third, we predicted that heavy social media users would be desensitized and therefore less accurate. And finally, we anticipated that multimodal content would be the easiest to spot since it offers 2 layers of clues. This research's main objectives were to compare AI media detection accuracy between students and adults, to examine the relationship between confidence and detection accuracy, to analyze the effect of social media use on detection accuracy, and to evaluate differences in detection accuracy across media types. Looking at the literature review, research shows that human ability to detect AI-generated media is fundamentally limited. For visual content, detection accuracy averages around 54%, which is barely above chance at 50% and rarely exceeds 60%, even when participants are explicitly instructed to identify manipulation. Repeated exposure or training examples do not significantly improve performance, indicating a lack of learning effect. For audio, deepfake speech detection performs slightly better at around 73%, but this still remains unreliable, particularly as synthesis quality improves. In fact, high-quality audiovisual deepfakes reduce detection accuracy to approximately 51 to 60% compared to about 69% for lower-quality synthetic media. Although multimodal content offers marginal improvements, it does not produce consistent or reliable detection. Overall, these findings demonstrate that human perception alone is insufficient for authenticating AI-generated media.
Beyond perceptual limits, detection failure is strongly shaped by confidence and response strategies. Even digitally literate users demonstrate detection accuracy of only 50 to 55%. While reporting relatively high confidence levels, averaging around 6.8 out of 10. This creates a confidence accuracy gap of roughly 10 to 15 percentage points, suggesting systemic overconfidence. Such overconfidence reduces verification behavior and increases susceptibility to misinformation, highlighting that digital fluency does not equate to digital literacy. Age does not sustainably change overall detection accuracy, which remains around 55 to 60% across groups. However, it influences error patterns. Older adults are more likely to produce false positives by misclassifying real content as AI-generated, while younger users tend toward false negatives through uncritical acceptance. Despite this, youth populations are often treated as a homogeneous group in prior research. Consequently, age-based differences in overconfidence, skepticism, and evaluative competence remain underexplored. In addition, existing deepfake and AI media detection research often focuses on a single content modality, such as text, images, or audio, rather than systematically comparing how detection accuracy varies across different media forms. As AI-generated content is increasingly multimodal, this narrows focus limits. Understanding of how modality influences evaluative judgment. This study addresses this gap by directly comparing detection performance across text, image, and combined text-image content, offering a more comprehensive assessment of how multimedia presentation affects credibility evaluation. Most deepfake detection studies rely on Western adult samples with minimal empirical data from South Asia, including Bangladesh. As a result, non-Western contexts remain underrepresented in a large-scale data sets, despite experiencing high levels of media saturation and limited access to detection tools. This regional imbalance restricts the generalizability of existing findings. Moving on to methodology, This study involved 185 participants from Dhaka, with 140 students and 45 adults. The sample included school and university students, parents, and academic professionals to capture diverse backgrounds and levels of digital experience. A mixed method research design was adopted to examine AI detection accuracy. This approach was chosen to support theory building by integrating quantitative and qualitative methods. For the data collection, participants evaluated 18 stimuli consisting of both AI-generated and authentic content. These included images, text, and combined image-text materials. For each stimulus, they made a binary judgment indicating whether the content was real or AI-generated, and then they rated their confidence using a 5-point Likert scale. Data analysis was conducted using Jamovi, where Welch's t-tests were used to compare students and adults, repeated measure ANOVA examined differences across media types, and Pearson correlations assessed the relationship between confidence and accuracy. From our quantitative analysis,
This slide examines whether confidence predicts AI detection accuracy. Across the full sample, confidence showed only a weak positive relationship with accuracy. When broken down by age group, this relationship was statistically significant only among students, and even then, the effect was small. For adults, confidence did not reliably predict performance. Overall, these findings suggest that feeling confident does not necessarily mean being accurate. This slide compares overall detection accuracy between students and adults. Students significantly outperformed adults with a medium effect size. On average, students scored about 6 percentage points higher. This difference indicates that age-related cognitive strategies, not educational or exposure, play a meaningful role in AI detection performance. This slide shows one of the strongest findings of the study. Detection accuracy varied significantly by media format. Images were detected most accurately while text-only content produced the lowest accuracy. Text-image stimuli did not significantly outperform text alone, indicating that adding visuals does not necessarily improve detection when misleading text is present. When comparing students and adults across media types, both groups performed best on images and struggled most with text-based content. However, students showed greater consistency, particularly with image stimuli. Adults demonstrated higher variability and more misclassification, especially for real text. This suggests that while strategies differ, text-based AI remains a vulnerability across generations. Here, we tested whether detection accuracy varied based on education level, social media usage, or exposure to AI-generated content. The results showed no statistically significant differences across any of these variables. This suggests that experience and familiarity alone does not improve detection performance, challenging the assumption that more exposure naturally leads to better judgment. Qualitative insights from 10 participants revealed clear group differences. Students relied mainly on visual familiarity cues such as two perfect faces, cartoon-like features, and smooth textures, while adults used analytical reasoning focused on lighting, realism, and context, sometimes leading to over-skepticism. One adult misclassified a real image as AI because it appeared overly vivid. Confidence often did not reflect accuracy. Students could be confidently wrong, and adults also made errors due to overanalysis. Prior AI exposure influenced trust, with adults distrusting polished content and some students identifying linguistic cues like repetitive or overly structured sentences. Media type mattered. Image-only content was easiest, but hyper-realistic images caused confusion. Text-only content was most difficult, especially for adults. Combined image-text content improved accuracy through cross-checking, though false positives persisted. Looking at our cross-validation of quantitative and qualitative data, some clear patterns emerge. Detection accuracy differed by age. Students aged 13 to 25 outperformed adults, scoring around 70.5% compared to 65.1%. This contradicts our initial hypothesis that adults would perform better. Interviews suggests the reason. Students' frequent social media use gives them an intuitive sense of AI-generated content. Confidence had a small positive effect for students but was unreliable for adults, who tend to overanalyze. Background factors like education or prior AI exposure did not significantly affect performance. Instead, evaluative competence, critical evaluation of cues was the key factor driving detection. Overall, human detection of AI-generated media is unreliable, especially for text, where accuracy is near chance. Images are easier to detect because their layered visual cues like lighting, texture, and structure allow viewers to deduce authenticity. Text or text-image combinations lack these clear cues, increasing misclassification. Students consistently outperformed adults due to pattern recognition, while adults' analytical strategies often caused over-skepticism. Confidence was a poor predictor of analysis across groups. In Dhaka's media-saturated environment, exposure alone is insufficient.
To conclude, future research on AI-generated media detection should adopt a more nuanced approach. Training programs need to be age-adaptive as students rely more on heuristic pattern recognition while adults use analytical reasoning. Longitudinal studies are needed to determine whether bias-aware training produces lasting improvements, as one-off interventions are unlikely to be effective. Research should also prioritize high-stakes contexts such as political and social news, where emotion, ideology, and cognitive biases strongly influence authenticity judgments. Finally, examining cultural factors and real-world decision-making under media overload will help develop AI literacy programs that better reflect everyday media consumption. Digital literacy should shift from simple AI exposure to evaluative competence, training users to recognize biases such as overconfidence and excessive skepticism to integrate textual, visual, and contextual cues. Calibrated skepticism is essential, as confidence does not guarantee accuracy, especially in highly polished media. Beyond individual skills, stronger regulation is needed. Stricter policies on AI-generated content can reduce systemic risk and shift responsibility toward institutions and developers instead of the people consuming them. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of AI.
Hello everyone. Today I'll be presenting our research titled Microplastic Leaching from PET Bottles in Dhaka. This research was conducted by myself, Sakib Hossain, and my co-researcher Ishraq Numair from International Hope School Bangladesh under the Youth Research Journal Winter Program 2025. Now before starting, I would like to thank our mentors Mohammad Sanaul Haq Shanto sir and Mohammad Azman Yakin Srizon sir for their guidance, as without them, making this paper would not be possible. This study explores how people's knowledge and perceptions of microplastics influence their everyday PET bottle usage behaviors, and how these behaviors may affect potential exposure risk. Firstly, I'm going to go over the background and basis for this research. Some important facts that you need to know are that microplastics are extremely small plastic fragments measuring less than 5 millimeters in size. Over the past decade, they have become a major environmental and public health concern due to their widespread presence in food, water, and air. Polyethylene terephthalate, commonly known as PET, is the plastic most widely used for beverage bottles in Bangladesh, especially in urban areas such as Dhaka. When people consume bottled drinks, they may unknowingly ingest microplastics, as PET bottles can release these particles into liquids. Several factors influence how much microplastic is released, meaning that certain handling practices can significantly increase exposure. However, many individuals in Bangladesh remain unaware of safe PET bottle usage practices, potentially increasing their long-term exposure risk. This concern formed the foundation of our research. Based on this background, our study aimed to answer three key research questions. First, how does awareness of microplastics influence an individual's PET bottle usage behavior in Dhaka? Second, how does perceived health risk influence PET bottle usage behavior? And finally, to what extent can knowledge and awareness help mitigate potential harm associated with microplastic exposure? These questions guided the design of our survey and subsequent analysis. To address these questions, we established four main research objectives. Firstly, we aim to determine whether microplastic knowledge and awareness influence PET bottle usage practices. We examined whether perceived health risks affect behavioral choices related to bottle use. We also investigated whether risk perception itself is linked to factual knowledge. Finally, we sought to identify the behavioral factors that most strongly influence potential microplastic exposure among residents of Dhaka, thereby highlighting where intervention efforts should be focused. Our literature review revealed several important findings. Multiple studies confirmed the presence of microplastics in bottled beverages, with concentrations in some cases reaching thousands of particles per liter. Research has shown that handling practices such as repeatedly opening bottle caps, squeezing bottles, or rough usage can significantly increase microplastic release. Furthermore, environmental factors such as sunlight exposure and heat further accelerate this process. Now, while microplastics may have not been conclusively linked to specific diseases, studies suggest that microplastics may be linked to potential health effects, particularly within the digestive system. Among the very few studies conducted in Bangladesh, they reveal very low levels of public awareness regarding microplastics. Current data from pre-existing studies actually reveal that over 60% of people are unaware about microplastics. This suggests that Bangladeshis may be particularly vulnerable to microplastic exposure. Going over our current literature, we identified three critical research gaps that we addressed in our study. We identified a clear knowledge-behavior gap, that is, while microplastic release has been studied experimentally, few studies examine how awareness translates into real-world behavior. Secondly, most existing research is conducted in high-income or Western contexts, leaving Bangladesh underrepresented. Third, many studies consider multiple plastic sources simultaneously, while a PET bottle, which is one of the most dominant sources in Bangladesh, often receives limited focused attention. Our research addresses these gaps by linking behavioral data with awareness and risk perception, and by developing a behavior-based exposure framework specific to PET bottle reuse in Dhaka.
Moving on to the methodology of this research, this study was conducted as a cross-sectional survey using Google Forms. The survey had four main sections. First, the basic demographic information. Second, the questions that tested factual knowledge about microplastics. Third, were questions that tested factual knowledge about microplastics. And lastly, the questions on PET bottle usage habits, and a Likert scale section to measure risk perception. For our sampling method, we chose convenience sampling, where participants were selected based on accessibility rather than random selection. In total, we had 132 valid responses, which were used for our analysis. Even though the sampling method had its limitations, it actually allowed us to quickly gather real-world data that reflects everyday bottle use behavior. From our survey responses, we constructed three key variables. For our first variable, which was our awareness score, which measured how much participants knew about microplastics and their possible health effects. For the second key variable was our risk perception score, which reflected how concerned participants felt about microplastics. And lastly was our exposure score, which was based on habits such as how frequently PET bottles were reused and how they were handled, which potentially could increase exposure. To assess these relationships between these variables mentioned before, we used Spearman rank correlational test, which is suitable for non-parametric data. We have also implemented significance testing to check whether the relationships we observed were meaningful in a statistical sense. All data analysis and visual diagrams were created and calculated via Jamovi software. Now on to the results and interpretation. As for our results and interpretation, firstly we noticed that awareness scores were spread across the scale, which showed that participants had mixed levels of knowledge. While some had a good understanding and comprehension of microplastics, others showed bounded and limited or incorrect information. Next, what we observed were that exposure scores showed high variation, which indicates that bottle use habits differed widely. Some participants reused PET bottles frequently and for long periods, while others followed relatively safer handling practices. And for our risk perception score, which were generally high, many participants expressed concern about microplastics and the potential health effects. Notably, this concern was often present even among participants with lower levels of factual knowledge or with participants with a knowledge deficit. By examining the relationships between the variables, we found and used a weak but statistically significant negative correlation between awareness and exposure. As you can see in our statistical results we calculated and gathered. In just simple terms, participants who knew more about microplastics tended to show slightly safer behavior such as reduce reuse or better handling of bottles. We also observed a weak positive correlation between awareness and risk perception. This suggests that higher knowledge is linked to greater concern about microplastics as a health issue. However, a significant finding was the lack of a strong correlation between risk perception and exposure, which meant that even when people are worried about microplastics, that concern does not always refer to the people diverting to safer behaviors or implementing safer practices of microplastics. Lastly, I'll conclude this video pitch with the conclusion and implications of our study. Overall, these findings show that awareness does play a function in shaping concern and, to a limited extent, behavior. However, the strength of these relationships remain very modest. This signifies a clear knowledge-behavior gap. Just simply knowing about microplastics or feeling concerned is often not enough and does not suffice to change daily habits. Our results suggest that practical factors such as convenience, affordability, and limited access to safe alternatives may have a stronger influence on behavior than awareness alone. This is especially significant in settings where bottled water is heavily relied upon. Hence, public health efforts aimed at reducing microplastic exposure should not focus only on awareness campaigns, but also education, as there is a need for practical and accessible solutions, such as affordable alternatives, improved access to safe drinking water, and so on. To conclude, this research shows that addressing microplastic exposure requires more than just increasing knowledge. It requires an understanding of real-world behavior and the everyday limitations and constraints people encounter. Thank you for your time.
Hey everyone, I'm Kazi from grade 9, and today we're going to take a look into investigating the impact of robotics education as a mandatory school subject on STEM academic performance for students in middle schools, a mixed methods approach. So, At the beginning of our presentation, I want to definitely thank YRJ Winter Research Program 2025, which gave us the opportunity to learn how to conduct an academic research work. Next, I want to express immense thankfulness to my amazing mentors, Sanal Haq Shamtabhaya and MD Asman Yakin Susan Sir, for their amazing class lectures, which helped all of us to learn how to not just stay limited to the knowledge we have, but expand that vast horizon into creating something meaningful. So, without further ado, let's continue. Have you ever wondered how exactly a human civilization advances? Well, one key step into doing that is through the path of technology. Through technology, people can solve real world problems, and those real world problems can help us to advance our human civilization. In today's world, it has become even more urgent to solve difficult real world problems such as manufacturing, healthcare, automation, construction, AI, and many other sectors. So, to solve all these things, we need people who have more than just educational degrees and can think out of the box and show a strong sign of intelligence. One effective way to do that is through enhancing critical thinking abilities for students. So, how can we enhance critical thinking abilities? One way that I was wondering is maybe we can implement robotics into the academic curriculum for students. If we can implement robotics, would it actually help in boosting critical analytic abilities? If it does, would it actually help us to create a generation which can have such experts? So, in this research study, we're going to basically investigate that. So, what's the background and context? As we all know, the 21st century is characterized by rapid technological advancement, particularly in areas such as robotics, automation, artificial intelligence, and engineering. And these developments have transformed the skills required for success in modern societies. Education systems are therefore increasingly expected to cultivate higher order cognitive skills, including critical thinking, adaptability, and problem solving, rather than relying solely on memorization based learning. So, robotics education has emerged as a promising pedagogical approach that enables students to engage with STEM concepts through hands on experiential learning. So, as we know, a famous quote that was said by Rodney Brooks, robotics is not just a field of science, it's a canvas for art, innovation, and progress. And that is exactly what we're going to investigate and how much effective is that point. So, why I was motivated for the study? Because a lot of the research papers that I've read, they have studied robotics on STEM education. They have widely done that. However, existing literature presents very inconclusive findings, and they don't really focus on having robotics as a mandatory formal subject. And furthermore, research conducted in developing countries remain very limited, and there is a lack of empirical research examining its effects when we're implementing it as a compulsory component in our school curriculum. And it's also very limited to countries like Bangladesh, so we have to really analyze all these things, which are very much essential to understand if this idea can be implemented, then it could be revolutionary not only for Bangladesh but for the entire world. So, what's the research question and hypothesis? We want to see if learning robotics as a mandatory school subject help improve students' academic performance, and that's basically the main part. So our main research design is we're gonna use numerical grade data for our quantitative analysis, and for qualitative data analysis, we've used Zoom and Google Form to analyze learning behaviors, problem solving strategies, and how people are persistent with their planning and strategy use during academic tasks. So for measuring the academic performance change, we've used SPSS and NVivo. And NVivo was used for qualitative data analysis by using thematic analysis, and SPSS was used for quantitative data analysis. So let's see how exactly we have done that. For our first step, we've used an independent sample t-test And what we're basically doing over here, we've seen that students with robotics exposure showed a smaller mean decline. As you can see, the mean is minus 5.56 and standard deviation is 3.75. And those without robotics showed almost a double decline, with the mean being minus 10.20 and the standard deviation being 6.59. The Levins test also showed that the p-value was 0.004, so there's obviously a statistically significant difference. For our test 2, what we've basically done, we've analyzed 8 Likert skill items, and as you can see that the means have ranged from 0.84, where skills learned in robotics help me to understand science or math, to mean of around 2.48, which involve I enjoy solving problems that require thinking rather than memorizing. And we can see that the lowest scoring item, mean 0.84, reflects that students generally do not perceive robotics concepts as directly improving math or science understanding, although the robotics exposed subgroup shows higher endorsement. For our third test, we're going to analyze basically the independent sample t-tests, and they were conducted for each of the 8 resilience indicators. So although most items did not reach statistical significance, we can see that there are directional trends consistently favored robotics students. Critically, the item skills learned in robotics help me to understand science or math displayed a highly significant difference between groups. As you can see that the p-value is less than 0.001. And we can also see that robotic students reporting substantially higher confidence, with the mean being 1.68 and non-robotic students being 0.00. Two additional patterns also strengthen the interpretation. We can see that non-robotic students were more likely to retry the same method, but robotic students were more frequently used to alternative strategies. Robotic students reported higher tendencies to analytic and iterative problem solving, and all of this can be very much visible. Finally, we have checked out our reliability. As you can see, we've used a cron batch alpha, and this shows excellent reliability as it is lesser than, greater than 0.9. And for our correlation analysis, we've used a Pearson correlation matrix, and you can see that the resilience attributes were strongly positively intercorrelated, as the R is 0.859 to 0.917, and the p-value is lesser than 0.001. So overall, we've got to know with our qualitative findings that analyzing previous work, decomposition, doing sequentially, and then trying again with a different method, visualization, have all shown strong support for robotic students. But trying again with the same method, then taking help from AI, which are all not really requiring critical thinking abilities, have shown support for non-robotic students. So basically, this is the overall interpretation. As you can see, that robotics education provides stronger academic resilience. All of these viewpoints were strongly supported. Robotics internalizes adaptive strategies. Resilience construct was valid, as we saw. Although we did see that resilience alone did not fully predict academic change, but robotics provides additional value, and we also saw behavioral evidence which reinforced our quantitative trends. So, for a conclusion, in an era where countries like Japan, China, and South Korea are progressing rapidly through technology and problem solving, Bangladesh, my country, is still lagging in technology integration and skills-based education. Closing this gap requires more than just traditional classroom teaching, and it calls for the development of a generation that can think critically, innovate, and solve real-world problems. Just think for once what will happen when we are able to create generations that just don't stay limited to their textbook, but look for ways to solve real-world problems and make Bangladesh toward a sustainable development and lead it to a stronger and global competitiveness. So maybe one day, if we can integrate robotics in such a way into our school academic curriculum, then it could play a key role. And that is what, after investigating so many things, we were able to support this statement. Although there still requires many other important research works, because as a high school student, I was only limited to 50 students. Maybe in the future, we could increase the number of students and look for a much stronger source of evidence. But I still believe this is the first step towards that revolutionary step into not only transforming Bangladesh, but in transforming the entire world. So here's the quick image of myself. I was the author. And that's it, guys. Thank you so much. I hope you liked it. Yeah, and have a great day.
Aggressive cancers Aggressive cancers remain one of the most devastating health challenges worldwide. In countries like Bangladesh, breast cancer affects a large and growing population, and aggressive subtypes such as triple-negative breast cancer are particularly alarming due to limited treatment options and poor prognosis. There is a growing desperation for therapies that are both effective and safe. One promising anti-cancer agent is melittin, a peptide derived from honeybee venom. Melittin shows strong cytotoxic effects against aggressive cancer cells, but its clinical use is severely limited due to nonspecific toxicity. This leads to my research paper where we explore how nanotechnology may help overcome these setbacks. Hello everyone, I am Mariam Ariana Nefertiti, and this is my presentation on our research topic, Niosomal and Immunoliposomal Delivery in Aggressive Cancer Models, a systematic review and exploratory meta-analysis with the emphasis on melittin payloads. Melittin is an amphipathic peptide known for its ability to disrupt cancer cell membranes and induce apoptosis. It has shown strong activity against aggressive and drug-resistant cancer models, including triple-negative breast cancer. However, when using its free form, melittin causes severe hemolysis and damage to healthy cells, making it unsafe for systemic use. To address this limitation, nanocarrier-based delivery systems have been proposed. Encapsulation allows melittin to be shielded from the healthy tissues, improves stability, and enables controlled and targeted delivery to tumor cells. Among these systems, niosomes and immunoliposomes stand out as two promising but mechanistically different approaches, and this comparison forms the foundation of our study. Our study focuses on two major issues, those being cytotoxicity and hemolysis. Nanocarrier usage is critical because it allows melittin's potent anti-cancer activity to be controlled rather than indiscriminate. Niosomes offer greater hemolytic safety, structural stability, and simple formulation. Immunoliposomes provide precise targeting, enhancing cytotoxicity and apoptosis, but its formulation remains complex along with the high cost. This highlights a trade-off between safety and precision. To achieve a more accurate comparison, we emphasize the need for head-to-head analysis under homogeneous experimental conditions which would better support potential systemic in vivo investigations and clinical applications. Rather than focusing on a single experiment, we chose a systematic review and exploratory meta-analysis to synthesize existing in vitro evidence in a structured and unbiased manner. Our review followed PRISMA 2020 guidelines and focused on peer-reviewed in vitro studies evaluating melittin-loaded nanocarriers in aggressive cancer models. We included 3 primary studies for qualitative narrative synthesis and 2 studies with sufficient quantitative data for exploratory meta-analysis. The main outcomes assessed were cytotoxicity, apoptotic induction, and hemolytic activity. This approach allowed us to identify efficacy safety trends rather than isolated findings. Our findings showed that nanocarrier encapsulated melittin consistently performed better than free melittin across all aggressive cancer models. Encapsulation improved the therapeutic profile by enhancing cytotoxicity, increasing apoptotic induction, and reducing nonspecific membrane damage. When comparing carriers, niosomal melittin significantly reduced hemolytic activity while maintaining anti-cancer efficacy, while immunoliposomal melittin demonstrated stronger cytotoxic and apoptotic effects due to active targeting mechanisms using their surface-bound antibodies. This study selection and reporting followed PRISMA 2020 guidelines for a quantitative synthesis. We used RevMen 5.4 for meta-analysis, standardized mean difference with HSG correction to compare cytotoxicity values, a random effect model to account for biological and methodological variability, and I-square statistics to assess heterogeneity. The meta-analysis revealed large effect sizes favoring niosomal melittin over free melittin. Clinically, these findings are significant significant for aggressive cancers like triple-negative breast cancer, where targeted and safer therapies are urgently needed. However, our study has limitations. Evidence is limited to in vitro models, and we only have a small number of eligible studies available presently. Methodological heterogeneity is also seen across experiments. These show our meta-analysis is exploratory and not definite. Future research should focus on standardized in vitro protocols, direct head-to-head comparisons between niosomes and immunoliposomes using homogeneous experimental conditions, in vivo validation for systemic safety and efficacy, and translational considerations for clinical feasibility. In conclusion, nanocarrier-based delivery significantly improves melatonin safety-efficacy balance. Niosomes offer better hemolytic safety, while immunoliposomes provide higher targeting precision, both supporting the future development of melatonin-based cancer nanotherapies. We urge further experimental investigation of melatonin in clinical research due to its potential in advancing therapies for aggressive cancers, a globally rising devastating issue. Lastly, I would like to sincerely acknowledge Youth Research Journal and our mentor MD Sanaul Haq Shantu for guidance and support throughout our research. Thank you for listening.
Hi everyone, I'm Munwali Mahir from Penpei School. My research is called The Architecture of Isolation, where I'm correlating access to public spaces with social anhedonia among youth in Dhaka. In simple terms, I'm looking at whether our urban planning is making us numb to each other. We always talk about air pollution or traffic in Dhaka, but we ignore the mental cost of living in a concrete cage. We exist in a city of millions, being physically crowded but socially silent. We walk past each other in a hurry, rarely reflecting on the fact that we have forgotten how to truly see one another. I wanted to know, is this grey environment actually changing the way our brain works? To study this, I looked at a theory by Ray Oldenburg called the third place. Think of it like this. Your first place is a home. Your second place is a school or work. But you need a third place, like a park, library, or cafe, to feel part of a community. These are social levelers, where status doesn't matter. Without them, we are just bouncing between stress and being alone. In Dhaka, these spaces are almost extinct. The World Health Organization says we need 9 square meters of green space per person. But in Dhaka, we have only 0.52 meters square. In some parts of Old Dhaka, this is practically zero. Our city has effectively taken away our right to public space. So, what happens to us? I believe it leads to social anhedonia. It's important to know the difference. Social anxiety is the fear of people. Social anhedonia is just not caring anymore. My guess was simple. I predicted a linear correlation. Logic says that if you live far away from a park, you will interact less and feel more numb. Essentially, the farther you live, the lonelier you are. To test this, I surveyed 34 young people in the age range of 15 to 25 in Dhaka. I used the revised social anhedonia scale, which is a 30-question test used by psychologists to measure how much joy you get from interactions with others. I compared their anhedonia scores to how many minutes they have to walk to a park. But the science told a different story. As you can see from my scatter plot, there was no clear pattern at all. My correlation score was minus 0.091, which is basically zero. Living further away didn't actually predict how numb someone felt. My hypothesis was wrong. Why? Because of the proximity paradox. The average person in my study lived only 5 minutes away from a park. Though they lived that close, over half of them said they visited rarely or never. This proves that just having a park on a map doesn't mean people can actually use it. If not distance, then what? My data shows 3 big things. Ghost parks. A park 5 minutes away is useless if it's dirty, dark, or feels unsafe. Digital substitutions. 30% of people said that they prefer staying online. For many, Discord, gaming, Facebook are the new third places. Adaptive numbness. Dhaka is so crowded that we just shut down our socially to survive the stress of the city itself. Of course, no research is perfect. To keep this study honest, I have to acknowledge few roadblocks. Selection bias. Data through the internet, my results mostly represent middle-class youth with stable web access. I might be missing the voices of those in lower income areas who feel the weight of this concrete city even more. Self-reporting. I relied on people to estimate their own walking distance and feelings. Human memory isn't always perfect, and social stigma can sometimes make people hide how they truly feel. Casualty. Finally, this is a correlation study. I can show that a park is close, but I can prove it's the only reason someone feels numb. Things like academic pressure or screen time are also part of the story. Not only that, the sample of the study is also considerably too low. To fix this, we don't just need more dots on a map. We need to make the existing park safe. Also, we need to recognize online spaces as valid community anchors for modern youth. Winston Churchill said, "We shape our buildings, therefore they shape us." Dhaka is shaping us to be isolated. We need to build spaces that actually invite us again. Dhaka is shaping us to be isolated. We need to build spaces that actually invite us to connect again. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Ayana and today I'll be presenting alongside my teammates Abias and Monosij. Together we'll discuss our research topic titled Evaluating Microbial Contamination in South Asian Street Food and Hygiene Practices in Uttara Dhaka. This study focuses on the hygiene conditions and potential microbial risks associated with commonly consumed street foods in this area and why this is an important public health concern. With that, we will now commence our presentation.
Street foods such as fuchka, chatpuri and jhalmuri are the main parts of the street food diet in Bangladesh, especially Dhaka, due to their affordability and cultural popularity. The people of Bangladesh consume these foods almost daily, irrespective of their socio-economic status, and although they're popular and relatively cheaper, they're frequently linked to foodborne illness because of the unsafe use of water and poor hygiene practice during preparation and serving. This paper assessed street food vendor hygiene practices and examined their association with gastrointestinal symptoms among consumers in densely populated neighborhoods of Uttara Dhaka, Sector 11, Sector 13, Sector 7, and Sector 3, where vendors were mostly found using a mixed methods design, while we surveyed 150 street food consumers to collect data on their thoughts on the hygiene practice, their recent consumption, and the symptoms experienced by them within 24 to 72 hours of having street food. Alongside, we conducted a semi-structured interviews with 25 vendors and applied a structured observational hygiene checklist covering hand washing, utensil cleanliness, food covering, and source of water. In summary, the statistics showed hygiene patterns and symptom occurrences, and chi-squared tests assessed associations between hygiene ratings and reported illness. The findings showed that most consumers perceived vendor hygiene as poor and nearly all reported at least one gastrointestinal symptom, with stomach pain and diarrhea as the most common. Observations indicated that over half of the vendors fell into the poor hygiene category, and vendors' self-reported hygiene consistently exceeded observed practices, especially for hand washing and protective barriers. A significant association was found between hygiene level and reported diarrhea, suggesting that poor vendor hygiene is linked to increase in consumer health risk. The study has contributed to the current knowledge by combining the results of consumer health with the practices of the vendors and providing evidence-based solutions to reduce consumer health risk while preserving the economic importance of street food in Bangladesh. Street food is the part of the daily routine in the South Asian nations, and particularly in Bangladesh, where thousands of sellers offer cheap meals to millions of citizens daily. Fuchka, chatpuri, and jhalmuri are foods that are not only the source of nutrition, but also a symbol of culture. Such foods are usually found close to schools, crowded markets, bus stops, and high traffic crossroads, thus making them affordable to students, service providers, and low income citizens. The Food and Agriculture Organization and the World Health Organization estimate that approximately 2.5 billion people consume street food globally every single day. The situation in Bangladesh is that the research indicates that over 30 million people have suffered from foodborne illnesses annually. This high prevalence is attributed to overpopulation, underdeveloped infrastructure, and poor water and sanitation systems. To most citizens in cities, street food is the most viable alternative as it is cheap and convenient. National hospital data shows that Bangladesh has remained having high rates of water and foodborne diseases, especially in urban areas where street food is highly relied upon by the population. These trends raise concerns about how contamination spreads and how it can be reduced without disrupting the cultural and economic importance of street food. The regional mortality. In the WHO Southeast Asia region, which includes Bangladesh, foodborne diseases cause approximately 175,000 deaths annually, which, while specific national mortality data is scarce, Bangladesh bears a significant portion of this regional burden due to its population size. Therefore, examining hygiene practices, identifying microbial risks, and exploring practical solutions, particularly through vendor education and training, becomes essential for safeguarding public health while maintaining the long-standing street food culture of Bangladesh. 1 in 10 people fall ill after eating contaminated food worldwide. Despite the widespread dependence on street food in Bangladesh, much of the existing studies address hygiene conditions or food contamination separately, with limited explanation of how these factors coexist within everyday street food environments. Furthermore, existing studies show that variation in vendors' hygiene behavior, water availability, and food safety standards is inconsistent. A focused examination of these practices consumers reported gastrointestinal symptoms offers a better understanding of street food safety challenges. With food safety receiving relatively little political attention, especially in developing countries, having reliable data on the actual national burden of foodborne diseases is essential to draw public attention and mobilize political will and resources to combat foodborne diseases. Thus, the purpose of the present study is the evaluation of the quality of hygiene as used by the vendors of the popular street foods, as well as discuss the correlation between such practices and the rate of the gastrointestinal symptoms among the consumers. The research will aim at adding to the safer street food consumption by determining critical risk factors and effective interventions that can ensure that street food consumption can retain its socio-economic value.
Street food in South Asian countries such as Bangladesh has been the main part of their cultural life, as thousands of peddlers feed millions of citizens every day with low-cost food. These vendors are available across markets, streets, schools, and busy intersections, making street food an accessible and affordable option for people from all socioeconomic backgrounds. Nevertheless, many studies have pointed out that the foods are usually being prepared and sold under poor sanitary conditions, where warning signals on the health of the population are extremely high. Bacterial spillage of street food has been common in South Asia, and bacteria like Salmonella spp have been extensively reported in food and water samples. In Bangladesh, street food vending is predominantly part of the informal sector, where enforcement of food safety regulation remain inconsistent. Studies done in Dhaka have established that about 40% of sampled street foods had high levels of coliform bacteria that exceeded safe levels, meaning that they were contaminated with feces and poor sanitation habits are being practiced. Globally, street food plays a significant role in daily nutrition, with approximately 2.5 billion people consuming street food every day worldwide. This contamination is usually associated with the fact that food is prepared using unclean water, utensils are washed with it, and hand hygiene is caused. In another study to determine the hygienic behaviors of Bangladeshi street food sellers, it was found that a majority of them could not use clean water to wash their hands, yet they use the same dirty water all day long. This highly enhances chances of cross-contamination of raw materials, utensils, and ready prepared foods. Microbial growth is also greatly affected by the environmental aspects. The high temperatures and humidity, especially during the monsoon season, promote the bacteria growth. Investigations have always shown that contamination level would be greater in the warmer season, which is linked to the seasonal peaks in diarrheal diseases. The World Health Organization estimates that 600 million people fall ill globally each year due to unsafe food, with low and middle income countries bearing the greatest burden. However, evidence from WHO and regional studies demonstrate that vendor hygiene training programs significantly reduce bacterial contamination, improve food safety practices, and protect both consumers and vendors without harming livelihoods. Although the current literature proves the existence of contamination of microbes in street foods, most studies are mainly concentrated on laboratory analysis or practices by the vendors themselves. Fewer ones combine consumer health outcomes with hygiene behaviors. This study suggests that sustainable improvements in street food safety require context-specific approaches that combine public health guidance and vendor training rather than merely relying on regulatory control. The present study fills that gap by conducting a synthesis of a consumer survey interviews with vendors to gain a better insight into the direct correlation between consumer ability through street food hygiene and gastrointestinal health risk factors.
This study was conducted in Uttara Dhaka, a densely populated urban area with a high concentration of street food vendors and consumers. A total of 25 street food vendors were selected from different locations within the Uttara City Corporation using purposive and convenient sampling. Vendors were chosen based on the type of food sold and the accessibility of their vending sites. All selected vendors operated small mobile street food carts located alongside roadsides or open public spaces within Uttara Dhaka. Only vendors selling fuchka, chotpuri or jhalmuri were included, as these foods are among the most frequently consumed street foods in Bangladesh and directly aligned with the study objectives. Consumer samples were collected from individuals who were purchasing or consuming food at these selected vendor sites. Additional participants were included if they reported frequent or occasional consumption of fuchka, chotpuri or jhalmuri from other street vendors. To ensure ethical compliance, only participants aged 13 years and above were included in the study. All participants were informed about the purpose of the study prior to participation, and voluntary consent was obtained to confirm that their involvement was willing and not coerced. Data were collected from street food vendors and consumers to assess hygiene practices and related health outcomes. Vendor data were obtained through a structured interview focusing on food handling, water use, utensil cleanliness, and hand hygiene. Consumer data were collected using a structured questionnaire recording perceptions of vendor hygiene and self-reported gastrointestinal symptoms following street food consumption. Vendor practices were additionally assessed through direct on-site observation using a standardized hygiene checklist during food preparation and service. A structured questionnaire was used to collect quantitative data from street food consumers in Uttara Dhaka. The survey was administered physically. The questionnaire was divided into 4 main sections. Section A was demographic information. This section collected demographic information including age group and gender for subgroup analysis. Section B was street food consumption patterns. This section assessed the frequency of street food consumption and the specific types of street foods consumed, including fuchka, chotpuri, and jhalmuri. These variables were used to estimate participants' level of exposure to street food. Section C was consumer perception of vendor hygiene. This section measured consumers' perceptions of hygiene practices using close-ended questions related to food covering, utensil cleanliness, hand washing practices, and water quality. Responses were structured using categorical options like yes, no, not sure, poor, average, or good for statistical analysis. Section D was reported gastrointestinal symptoms. The consumers were asked to report whether they experienced symptoms such as stomach pain, diarrhea, nausea, or vomiting within 24 to 72 hours after consuming street food. Vendor hygiene practices were assessed using two complementary methods: a structured hygiene observation checklist and a short vendor interview form. The observation checklist was used to record directly observable hygiene behaviors during food preparation and service, such as food covering, utensil cleanliness, hand washing practices, water source usage, and waste management. In addition, a structured vendor interview form was administered to collect self-reported data on hygiene practices, including utensil washing frequency, hand hygiene habits, food storage methods, water sources, and prior hygiene training. Combining observational data with interview responses allowed for cross-verification of vendor practices and enabled comparison between reported and observed hygiene behaviors, strengthening the reliability and validity of the findings. The study examined the relationship between street food vendor hygiene practices and the occurrence of gastrointestinal symptoms among consumers. Variables were operationalized using structured observation and survey instruments. The independent variable in this study was street food vendor hygiene practices. Vendor hygiene was operationalized as a composite hygiene score measured using a structured observation checklist and supported by a vendor interview form. The hygiene assessment included the following components. Food covering was recorded as present, 1, or absent, 0 during service. Utensil cleanliness assessed based on visible cleanliness of plates, spoons, and preparation tools during observation. Hand washing practices observed and reported hand washing behavior between key tasks, including use of soap, water, or gloves. Water source used, determined by observation and vendor self-report regarding the use of clean water sources such as tap, bottled, or tanker water. Scores for individual items were summed to generate an overall hygiene score for each vendor. Based on the total score, vendors were categorized into 3 hygiene levels: poor hygiene, average hygiene, and good hygiene. Dependent variable was the frequency of gastrointestinal symptoms among consumers. Gastrointestinal symptoms were measured through self-reported data from consumers who indicated the presence or absence of symptoms within 24 to 72 hours of street food consumption. The symptoms assessed included stomach pain, diarrhea, nausea, and vomiting. Each symptom was recorded as present or absent. The total number of symptoms reported by each participant was used to indicate the level of gastrointestinal impact. Several control variables were considered to minimize the influence of external factors on the relationship between vendor hygiene practices and consumer gastrointestinal symptoms. Geographical location was controlled by limiting data collection to street food vendors and consumers within Uttara Dhaka. This reduced variability related to environmental sanitation, water quality, and urban infrastructure. Age group was treated as a control variable because susceptibility to foodborne illness differs across age categories. Data were therefore analyzed by age groups to account for differences in immune vulnerability. Time and season of data collection were controlled by conducting the study within a consistent period and similar weather conditions. This helped to reduce the effect of seasonal variation in bacterial growth and food spoilage rates. Sample size consistency was maintained by collecting data from a similar number of vendors and consumers across all study sites, ensuring balanced representation and improving comparability of results. This section presents the quantitative findings of the study based on consumer surveys, vendor observations, and statistical analysis. Results are organized according to the research questions and focus on demographics, hygiene perception, health outcomes, vendor hygiene levels, and inferential statistics. A total of 150 consumers who had recently consumed street food in Uttara Dhaka were surveyed. The demographic distribution is presented below. The majority of respondents, of about 66%, were between 14 and 24 years, indicating that adolescents and young adults are the primary consumers of street food in the study area. The gender distribution is given below. Male respondents slightly outnumbered female respondents, though both genders were well represented. The street food consumption frequency is below. The majority of respondents consumed street food infrequently, with over half of about 53.3% reported consumption only 1 to 2 times, while fewer consumers ate street food 3 to 4 times of about 25.3%, or 5 or more times, which is 21.3%. The food type that the consumers ate are given below. Fuchka was the most commonly consumed street food, reported 40%, followed by chotpuri, 34.7%, and jhalmuri, 25.3%, indicating a strong preference for water-based street foods. Consumers were asked to rate the hygiene of the street food vendors they purchased from as poor, average, or good. A clear majority of consumers, like 64.7%, perceived vendor hygiene as poor, suggesting widespread concern regarding food safety among street food consumers. Consumers were asked whether they experienced any gastrointestinal symptoms within 24 to 48 hours after consuming street food. Multiple responses were allowed. The results show a high prevalence of gastrointestinal symptoms, with nearly all respondents, like 96%, reported at least one symptom. Stomach pain and diarrhea were the most commonly reported outcomes. Vendor hygiene was assessed through direct observation using a hygiene scoring system based on 5 indicators: clean water use, hand washing, clean utensils, food covering, and use of gloves or barriers. Based on total hygiene scores, vendors were classified as followed. More than half of the observed vendors, of 56%, demonstrated poor hygiene, while only a small proportion of 16% consistently followed proper hygiene practices. To examine relationships between key variables, chi-square tests were conducted. A chi-square test was used to assess the association between vendor hygiene rating and reported diarrhea. The test is given below. The test results came out to be that chi-square equals to 16.83 and p equals to 0.00022. The chi-square test shows a significant association between hygiene rating and reported diarrhea. Therefore, we reject the null hypothesis and accept the alternative hypothesis that hygiene ratings and symptoms like diarrhea are associated. An additional chi-square test was conducted to examine whether age group was associated with reporting symptoms. Younger consumers of 14 to 24 years reported symptoms more frequently than older age groups. The test indicated a statistically significant association where p was less than 0.05. This suggests that younger consumers who consume street food more frequently may be at higher risk of foodborne illness. This section integrates findings from vendor self-reported data, direct observational data, and consumer health outcomes to strengthen the validity of the results through triangulation. By comparing multiple data sources, this analysis reduces bias and provides a more accurate assessment of hygiene practices and their health implications. To assess the reliability of vendor-reported hygiene practices, responses from the vendor questionnaire were directly compared with observations of the same vendors during food preparation and service. This comparison revealed consistent over-reporting of hygiene practices by vendors. The comparison of hygiene practices is given below. Across all hygiene indicators, self-reported compliance exceeded observed behavior. The largest discrepancies were observed in hand washing, use of gloves or barriers, and food covering. These gaps indicate a clear reporting bias where vendors appear aware of recommended hygiene practices but fail to apply them consistently in real settings. This suggests that knowledge of hygiene does not translate into practice, likely due to time constraints, lack of resources, or absence of enforcement. A key insight is that direct observation revealed hygiene risks that would have been underestimated if vendor self-reports were used alone. This finding highlights the importance of observational methods in food safety research and strengthens the credibility of the study. To examine whether poor hygiene practices translated into measurable health outcomes, vendor hygiene levels were compared with consumer-reported gastrointestinal symptoms. Chi-square analysis demonstrated a statistically significant association between poor vendor hygiene, higher reports of gastrointestinal symptoms, particularly diarrhea and stomach pain. Chi-square equals to 16.83, p equals to 0.00022. Since p is less than 0.05, the null hypothesis was rejected, confirming that hygiene level and health outcomes are not independent. The observed pattern was that vendors classified as poor hygiene were linked with higher rates of diarrhea and higher rates of stomach pain. Vendors with average or good hygiene were associated with lower symptom reporting. This quantitative relationship is consistent with observational findings like poor hand washing and uncovered food, consumer perceptions of hygiene, and established microbiological literature on street food contamination. By combining vendor self-reports, direct observational data, consumer health outcomes, and statistical testing, the study achieves strong methodological triangulation. The triangulation summary is given below. All data sources independently point to the same conclusion. Poor hygiene practices among street food vendors are strongly associated with negative health outcomes in consumers. This convergence of evidence greatly increases the internal validity of the study and reduces the likelihood that findings are due to chance, reporting bias, or isolated observations.
This study examined the hygiene practices of street food vendors in Uttara Dhaka and explored their relationship with gastrointestinal symptoms reported by consumers. By integrating descriptive statistics, inferential analysis, and triangulation between vendor self-reports, direct observations, and consumer health outcomes, the findings provide important insights into the public health risks associated with street food consumption in Bangladesh. The descriptive and inferential statistics demonstrate a clear association between poor vendor hygiene and adverse health outcomes among consumers. More than half of the observed vendors, 56%, were classified as having poor hygiene, while only a small proportion, 16%, met the criteria for good hygiene. Correspondingly, a very high percentage of consumers, 96%, reported at least one gastrointestinal symptom after consuming street food. The chi-square test confirmed that this relationship was statistically significant, leading to the rejection of the null hypothesis. This indicates that the observed association between hygiene level and symptoms is unlikely to be due to chance. Symptoms such as diarrhea and stomach pain, which were the most commonly reported, are consistent with illnesses caused by foodborne pathogens. The results showed that younger consumers, particularly those aged 14 to 17 and 18 to 24, reported gastrointestinal symptoms more frequently than older age groups. Younger individuals are more likely to consume street food frequently due to school schedules, social habits, and limited access to home-prepared meals. Increased exposure naturally raises the likelihood of consuming contaminated food. Younger consumers may also be less selective about vendor hygiene, prioritizing taste, price, and convenience over safety considerations. These findings are consistent with previous studies in South Asia, which have identified adolescents and young adults as high-risk groups for foodborne illnesses. Direct observation revealed several critical hygiene failures among vendors, particularly in hand washing, use of protective barriers, and food covering. Only 38% of vendors were observed washing their hands during food preparation, and just 19% used gloves or protective barriers. Such practices significantly increase the risk of microbial contamination, especially for ready-to-eat foods like fuchka, chotpoti, and chalmuri. The comparison between self-reported and observed hygiene practices revealed substantial reporting bias, with vendors consistently overestimating their compliance with hygiene standards. The observed hygiene deficiencies align closely with the high prevalence of consumer symptoms, reinforcing the conclusion that unsafe food handling practices translate into measurable health risks. The findings of the study are consistent with existing literature on street food safety in Bangladesh and other South Asian countries. Microbiological studies have identified significant levels of pathogenic bacteria in street foods sold by roadside vendors. These pathogens are well-known causes of diarrhea, nausea, and abdominal pain. While the present research did not conduct laboratory testing, the combination of poor observed hygiene practices and high symptom prevalence strongly supports the likelihood of microbial contamination. Furthermore, previous research has shown that vendor training programs and improved hygiene practices can significantly reduce bacterial contamination without negatively affecting vendor livelihood. The results of this study highlight street food hygiene as a critical public health issue in urban Bangladesh. Given the cultural and economic importance of street food, outright restriction is neither feasible nor desirable. Instead, targeted interventions such as vendor hygiene education, access to clean water, and regular monitoring offer practical solutions. Improving vendor practices could substantially reduce foodborne illnesses while preserving the social and economic benefits of street food. This study investigated hygiene practices among street food vendors in Uttara Dhaka and examined their relationship with gastrointestinal symptoms reported by consumers. By combining vendor observations, self-reported practices, consumer surveys, and statistical analysis, the research provides a comprehensive assessment of food safety risks associated with popular street foods such as fuchka, chotpoti, and chalmuri. The findings indicate that the poor hygiene practices are widespread among street food vendors, with more than half of the observed vendors classified as having poor hygiene. Critical gaps were identified in hand washing, use of protective barriers, food covering, and access to clean water. At the same time, a very high proportion of consumers reported gastrointestinal symptoms, particularly stomach pain and diarrhea. Statistical analysis confirmed a significant association between vendor hygiene levels and consumer illness, leading to the rejection of the null hypothesis. These results reveal that inadequate hygiene during food preparation and handling is a major contributor to foodborne illnesses among street food consumers. The study's findings are consistent with existing microbiological research that has identified pathogenic bacteria in street foods, providing biological support for the observed statistical relationships. Based on these findings, several practical recommendations can be made. For vendors, basic hygiene training focusing on regular hand washing, use of clean water, proper utensil cleaning, and food covering could significantly reduce contamination risks. For policymakers, The implementation of low-cost vendor training programs, improved access to clean water in vending areas, and routine hygiene monitoring could enhance food safety without threatening vendor livelihoods. Public awareness campaigns may also encourage consumers to prioritize hygiene when selecting street food vendors. In conclusion, improving hygiene practices in street food vending represents a feasible and effective strategy for reducing foodborne illnesses while preserving the cultural and economic importance of street food in Bangladesh. Continued collaboration between health authorities, vendors, and communities is essential to ensure safer street food consumption in urban settings. With all that being said, this brings us to the end of our presentation. Thank you for listening.
Hello everyone, my name is Sakib Hossain and today I'm going to talking about my research topic being how EV charging infrastructure relate to the number of registered electrical vehicles across these states, 9 states to be precise. So let's get started. Abstract EV changing correlation. So when I firstly started off this research based on my research proposal, there was an initial analysis showing a strong positive correlation between charging stations and registered EVs. From that, I found categorized it into two parts, being public stations and private stations. Public stations showed a correlation of 0.99 and private stations showed a correlation of 0.98. You might be wondering why public stations and private stations altogether showed such a high score of near perfect one. That is because of California. California having such a high number of registered vehicles and charging infrastructure in both private and public stations. Thus, I did a sensitivity analysis excluding California, which yielded a correlation of 0.82. Thus, it confirmed the consistent scaling across all markets, thus showing a positive correlation across all markets. Introduction: Driving decarbonization. The transport sector, responsible for 25% of the energy-related CO2 emissions, is actively pursuing decarbonization. Landmark federal policies like the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act have allocated billions for the consumer tax credits and charging stations. EV growth heavily depends on the charging infrastructure, with plans to build 500,000 public chargers by 2030. However, range anxiety remains a significant barrier to EV adoption, making charging infrastructure crucial for consumer confidence. Charging infrastructure must grow in accordance with the number of registered EVs, as said by a research paper that I gave a reference to at my reference page. So, research question: how does the number of public and private charging infrastructure relate to the registered EVs in states with significant adoption? So I approached this research question with hopes that I target the actual investors, that where should they invest their money on. So it should only be liable that they invest upon a state with the higher number of EVs but lower number of infrastructure in according to balance it out. So to show a perfect correlation for them to believe upon that statement, I pursued this research. So as the consumers head into the EV market, they are faced with a couple of psychological factors, suppose as range anxiety, a major barrier to EV adoption despite modern batteries being sufficient for daily commute. And there's also the distinct part as of public and private charging stations. Well, private charging stations supports of 80% of EVs. Public charging drives charging liquidity for urban dwellers. There is also another factor to keep in mind when consumers are heading into the EV market, as there is a policy impact. Federal policies like an NEV-I aim for 500,000 public chargers by 2030. Financial incentives are significantly able to boost adoption. This is the data analysis that I carried upon across all the 9 states, finding out the number of registered EVs and the charging number of public and private charging infrastructure. So I visualized the correlation in Microsoft Excel and plotted a scatter plot for private and public charging station, both showing a positive correlation, which I carried out via Pearson's correlation coefficient, which I carried out by this formula. Placing on the total number of sum of x and y, x being number of charging stations, y being number of registered EVs, and n being the number of states. I did it 3 times for n being 9, for 2 for private and public, n being 8 for public without California to do a sensitivity check. For them, I found my key findings, which I found a positive gradient. Higher charging infrastructure ability directly correlates with a greater number of registered EVs combating range anxiety. There was also a couple of limitations. As far I included like 9 states. Okay, it should be like more than 9, so that's a limitation to take into effect. I also used absolute values rather than per capita measures, potentially representing populous states. So states with a high number of populations will have a larger effect, thus the deviations as you see here are caused. So further research with more states and per capita analysis can definitely improve the reliability. And for the deviations, as I said before, population and geography, public awareness, and government incentives like government benefits for suppose lower tax for electrical vehicles, more free charging for the first month. Couple of government incentives are given there. So these deviations that you see from the graph are caused by these factors. So as for the conclusion, we are slowly paving the way for EV adoption, as there is a confirmed correlation, which this study confirms a strong positive correlation between charging infrastructure and registered EVs, thus finding out how they relate to each other. Overcoming barriers, improved charging access builds consumer confidence and mitigates range anxiety, as we have seen across the circuit. Her holistic approach, while crucial, and charging infrastructure not the sole determinant. Government incentives and policies also play a part. As I said it before, I'm saying it again. Government roles like lower tax, free charging, home charging, it will play a huge part in it. So that's all I have to say for my research paper. Thank you for your time for listening. Thank you.
Over the past few years, there has been a significant increase in the level of mental health disorders among the youth, and suffering from negative intrusive thoughts is one of them. Specifically in Bangladesh, families often have limited knowledge regarding these mental health disorders, which makes it difficult for the parents to provide appropriate support to their children. This quantitative research focuses on gender differences in the frequency of negative intrusive thoughts among Bangladeshi youth ages 15 to 25. Welcome to my presentation. My name is Yasha Mumtahina, and in this research I will discuss gender differences in intrusive thoughts among Bangladeshi youth. What are intrusive thoughts? These are unwanted thoughts or ideas that pop up suddenly, causing distress for individuals and conflicting with their moral values and beliefs. Global research studies show that women tend to suffer from these thoughts more frequently than men. Since the COVID-19 pandemic, there has been a rise in the level of mental health disorders among adolescents. But why does it matter in Bangladesh? In Bangladesh, as I mentioned previously, families acquire limited knowledge about this condition. Discussing this topic is crucial as unawareness may cause several disruptions amongst the youngsters, such as increased distress, anxiety, and shame, impacting mental health and daily life. Although globally research studies have shown gender differences in intrusive thoughts and youth mental health, no study has yet particularly examined whether Bangladeshi girls aged 15 to 25 have frequent intrusive thoughts or Bangladeshi boys aged 15 to 25. Addressing this gap will help inform mental health interventions. So, what does this research aim to find? This research questions whether Bangladeshi girls aged 15 to 25 experiences a higher frequency of negative intrusive thoughts than boys. In other words, is the gender difference among Bangladeshi youth significant? In line with the global research, two hypotheses were formulated. Firstly, the null hypothesis is that there will be no significant difference in the frequency of negative intrusive thoughts among Bangladeshi boys and girls aged 15 to 25. Secondly, the alternative hypothesis is that there will be a significant difference in the frequency of negative intrusive thoughts among Bangladeshi boys and girls aged 15 to 25. Moving on, this section explains how we conducted our research to test these hypotheses. I'll explain who participated, how we collected data, and what tools we used. This research employs a quantitative method to compare the frequency of negative intrusive thoughts between Bangladeshi girls and boys. To begin with, 138 responses were collected from Bangladeshi youth aged 15 to 25, of which 71 were females and 67 were males. Although we aimed for equal numbers, the difference is quite insignificant, with 51% female and 49% male. All of the responses were from ages 15 to 25 and came from different regions of Bangladesh, including Dhaka, Chittagong, Sylhet, Noakhali, and more. Additionally, data collection was conducted via an online survey distributed across various social media platforms, including Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, Viber, and Discord. The survey questions were like this. Furthermore, the main tool used was called the OCIR, which stands for Obsessive Compulsive Inventory Revised. This is a credible questionnaire used in research around the world to measure obsessive compulsive symptoms, including negative intrusive thoughts. It comprises 18 questions, including a Likert scale in each question. The score ranges from 0 to 72, a total score of 18 or higher, or an average of 2.5 on any subscale may indicate OCD but does not confirm it. Finally, to analyze the data, this research study used the independent samples t-test. This test compares the average scores of two groups, in this case girls and boys, to determine whether the difference between them is statistically significant. Now let's see what this research actually found. To start, let's discuss this descriptive statistics. A total of 138 responses were received, with 71 female responses and 67 male responses. The mean score ranged from 2 to 64. The mean score for females was 32.03, with a standard deviation of 15.150. For girls, the mean score was higher and standard deviation and the variation was greater. Similarly, the mean score for males is 26.06 and the standard deviation is 12.401. For boys, compared with the girls, the mean score was lower and the variation was smaller. On average, girls scored 5.970 points higher than boys, indicating that girls had a greater frequency of negative intrusive thoughts than boys. For girls, the score variation was greater, suggesting that some had a higher frequency of intrusive thoughts and some had very little, whereas boys showed less variation. But is this difference in the mean score statistically significant? That's where our statistical test comes in. Before conducting the main statistical test, it was necessary to check whether the two groups had equal variances using Levene's test for equality of variances. As we saw earlier, girls had a higher standard deviation than boys, indicating greater variability. The Levene's test gave an f-value of 4.261 and a p-value of 0.041. As the p-value is less than 0.05, the variances are not equal. They are significantly different. Determining this is crucial as it determines which version of the t-test we will use. As the variances aren't equal, we will use equal variances not assumed, adjusting for different spreads. Coming to the main tests. T-value calculated was 2.539. This is our test statistic. It measures how different the two groups are. The larger the value of t, the greater the difference. A t-value of 2.539 shows a moderate to substantial difference between the groups. Coming to degrees of freedom, df is equal to 133.378. This technical value accounts for our sample sizes and unequal variances. It's mainly used to calculate the p-value. Now, the p-value, the value of p, was found to be 0.012. This is the probability of observing such a difference if there were no real difference. That is, if the null hypothesis were true. A p-value of 0.012 means that there is only a 1.2% chance that this result is due to random chance. Since 0.012 is less than our significance threshold of 0.05, our result is statistically significant. We can reject the null hypothesis. The difference is real. The mean difference between groups is 5.968 points, with girls scoring higher. So this means Bangladeshi girls experience significantly more negative intrusive thoughts than Bangladeshi boys, a difference that is statistically significant and very unlikely to be due to chance. Regarding our hypothesis, we rejected the null hypothesis that there will be no difference between groups. Instead, we accepted the alternative hypothesis confirming that girls scored higher than boys. This means our original prediction was correct. This image shows the results from the independent samples t-test. Now that we have the results, let's see how our findings align with the previous research on gender differences in intrusive thoughts, both globally and in similar cultural contexts. Research from around the world consistently showed that females report higher rates of anxiety and OCD disorders compared to males. This pattern of a gender gap has been observed across various countries and cultures, suggesting that it is a widespread phenomenon rather than one limited to a specific region. Similarly, a large meta-analysis of 29 studies involving 80,879 participants found that during COVID-19, about 25% of children and adolescents had clinically elevated depression and 20% had elevated anxiety. Both rates were double what was seen before the pandemic. Additionally, a national mental health survey in Bangladesh found that 21.5% of women had common mental health disorders compared to 15.7% of men, with women about twice as likely to experience depression and anxiety. Our results support the National Mental Health Survey's findings, but focus on younger people 15 to 25, and specifically on intrusive thoughts. These findings have important implications for mental health in Bangladesh. I'll highlight a few key points. Firstly, the clinical implications. Mental health professionals such as psychiatrists, psychologists, and counselors should be familiar with gender differences when assessing and treating intrusive thoughts. As girls are more prone to these symptoms, personalized treatment for female patients is crucial. Secondly, service delivery implications. Schools, counseling centers, and community mental health programs play a vital role in supporting youth mental health in Bangladesh. Our findings suggest that these services should provide targeted resources, counseling, and awareness programs specifically focused on girls who may have greater mental health needs related to intrusive thoughts and anxiety. Thirdly, policy implications. At the policy level, government and mental health organizations should recognize that girls are disproportionately affected by intrusive thoughts and related disorders. Policies, resource allocation, and professional training should be gender informed, ensuring that programs and awareness campaigns address the unique needs of girls as well as boys. Like all research studies, this research consists of limitations as well. Let's get through them. To begin with, the sample was recruited via non-random convenience sampling on social media. This introduces sampling bias and likely excludes rural and low-income youth, limiting generalizability to all Bangladeshi adolescents. Additionally, all data are self-reported, raising concerns about social desirability, recall, and response biases, especially given mental health stigma in Bangladesh. Furthermore, the cross-sectional design prevents any conclusions about causality between gender and intrusive thoughts. Our study only shows that girls have more intrusive thoughts at one point in time. It can't show what causes this or how it changes. To find that out, we'd need to follow people over time. Finally, our sample of 138 was mainly urban and had internet access, so it doesn't fully represent rural or marginalized groups. This small size also limits how much we can generalize the results. However, these limitations highlight key areas for future research. In future, studies should use longitudinal designs to clarify if and how gender differences in intrusive thoughts change over time. Conduct qualitative studies to explore how Bangladeshi youth experience and cope with intrusive thoughts in different cultural contexts. Recruit participants from diverse geographic and socioeconomic backgrounds to improve representativeness. Test intervention strategies, for example, cognitive behavioral therapy, mindfulness, and others, for effectiveness across genders. Investigate mediators and moderators, including family dynamics, peer relationships, and cultural beliefs about gender roles and emotions. To summarize this research, it clearly demonstrates that Bangladeshi girls aged 15 to 25 experience significantly more negative intrusive thoughts than boys of the same age. This isn't a small difference, it is statistically significant, real, and reliable. This study gives important local evidence of a mental health gap affecting young Bangladeshi women. While this pattern is seen worldwide, our study confirms it also exists in Bangladesh. It is crucial because girls need support and resources that address their actual needs. Schools, clinics, and families can use this information to better help girls as well as boys, and mental health policies can be more targeted and effective. Understanding the problem is the first step to solving it. By highlighting this gender gap, we are paving the way for better support and policies. Every youth deserves proper mental health care, and I hope this research helps make that possible. Thank you so much for your time and consideration.